So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Somewhere in the world right now, there is a person who woke up this morning and chose not to go to work. Not because they were sick, not because it was a holiday, but because at some point in the past, they made a series of quiet, unglamorous decisions that gave them the freedom to spend their time however they chose. They are not a lottery winner. They are not a tech founder. They are, in all likelihood, someone completely ordinary who understood a set of ideas that most people are never taught, and who followed those ideas with more patience than most people manage. Tonight, we are going to learn those ideas slowly, completely, without any rush. The concept is called financial independence, and it is both simpler and more profound than most people realize. Let us begin where all good stories begin, which is not with a definition, but with a person. His name was Vicki Robin's collaborator, and his story became one of the most quietly influential financial narratives of the late 20th century. Joe Dominguez was born in 1938 in New York City, raised in Spanish Harlem in circumstances that were, by any measure, modest. His family had little. Money was not a resource to be taken for granted. But Joe was smart and driven, and he found his way into Wall Street, working as a financial analyst. By his early 30s, he was making what was, for the era, excellent money. And then, at 31, he stopped. He retired, permanently. Not to luxury, not to a beach house in the Hamptons. He retired to a life structured entirely around what he actually wanted to do with his time, which turned out to be community activism, music, and the project of helping others think differently about their relationship with money. He had saved enough, invested carefully enough, and reduced his expenses deliberately enough that his investments generated more income than he needed. He spent the rest of his life, until his death in 1997, living on a very modest income derived entirely from the interest on his savings. He did not return to paid work. He did not need to. What Joe Dominguez understood, and what he eventually articulated in a book he co-wrote with Vicki Robin called Your Money or Your Life, is a simple but radical idea. The idea is that money is not really money. Money is life energy. It is the compressed form of the hours you spent earning it. And when you understand that, truly understand it, your relationship with money changes completely. Let us unpack that idea, because it is the philosophical foundation of everything that follows tonight. When you earn money, you are exchanging a portion of your finite life for it. You have a limited number of hours on earth. You spend some of them doing things that generate income. The money you receive in exchange is not just numbers in a bank account. It is crystallized time. It is the hours of your life, made portable and storable. This reframes the question of spending in a striking way. When you buy something, you are not just spending money. You are spending the hours of your life that it took to earn that money. The $50 dinner did not cost $50. It cost however many hours of your working life were needed to generate $50 after taxes. If you earn $25 per hour net, the dinner cost 2 hours of your life. This is not an argument for never spending money on enjoyable things. Life is meant to be lived, and money exists to make living better. But this framing changes how conscious and deliberate your spending becomes. When you feel the hours in the price tag, you naturally become more selective. The things that genuinely enrich your life feel worth the hours. The things that do not feel worth the hours become less appealing. Joe Dominguez called this practice keeping track of your real hourly wage and comparing every purchase to it. The television you watch twice and then ignore. The subscription you forget to cancel. The upgrade you bought because it was on sale even though you did not need the original version. Each of these, when expressed in hours of your life, starts to feel different. And when you start spending fewer hours of your life on things you do not actually value, something interesting happens. You need fewer total hours of paid work to sustain your life, which means the distance between where you are and financial independence gets shorter. Financial independence is usually defined as the point at which your passive income from investments, rental properties, or other assets that require no ongoing labor from you, equals or exceeds your living expenses. At that point, you no longer need to work for money. Work becomes a choice rather than a necessity. This is sometimes called the crossover point, the moment when the line of your investment income crosses above the line of your expenses. And the extraordinary thing about this concept is that the crossover point is not determined primarily by how much money you have. It is determined by the relationship between two things: how much your investments generate and how much you spend. This means that someone who earns a large income but spends it all is no closer to financial independence than someone who earns nothing. And someone who earns a modest income but saves aggressively and spends deliberately can reach financial independence faster than someone who earns twice as much but lives lavishly. Income gets you started. The gap between income and expenses is what actually builds the bridge. There is a number that sits at the heart of the practical mathematics of financial independence, and understanding it changes how you think about saving. The number is 25. Specifically, the guideline that has emerged from decades of research into retirement finance is this: if you have saved 25 times your annual expenses, you are likely to be financially independent for life, assuming a reasonable investment allocation and a modest withdrawal rate. This comes from what is called the 4% rule, derived from a famous study conducted in 1994 by 3 finance professors at Trinity University in Texas. William Bengen had done related work slightly earlier. The research looked at historical market data going back to 1926 and asked a simple question: what percentage of a portfolio could a retiree withdraw each year without running out of money over a 30-year period? The answer, across nearly all historical scenarios, including the Great Depression, the 1970s stagflation, and the various recessions in between, was approximately 4%. At that withdrawal rate, portfolios invested in a mix of stocks and bonds historically sustained themselves for 30 years in almost every scenario tested. 4% of a portfolio means the portfolio equals 25 times the annual withdrawal. If you spend $40,000 per year, you need $1 million invested. If you spend $20,000 per year, you need $500,000. If you spend $60,000, you need $1.5 million. The lower your expenses, the smaller the number you need to hit. And hitting a smaller number takes less time. This is the mathematics of financial independence in its most concentrated form. 2 levers, expenses and savings rate, and the magic number 25. Connecting them. Now, let us talk about the savings rate, because this is where financial independence stops being abstract and starts being practical. Your savings rate is the percentage of your income that you save and invest, rather than spend. If you earn $3,000 per month and spend $2,500, your savings rate is approximately 17%. If you earn $3,000 and spend $2,000, your savings rate is 33%. If you earn $3,000 and spend $1,500, your savings rate is 50%. The relationship between your savings rate and the time required to reach financial independence is one of the most startling pieces of mathematics in all of personal finance, and it was laid out with unusual clarity by a blogger and engineer who wrote under the name Mr. Money Mustache. His real name is Peter Adeney. He was born in Canada in 1974, studied engineering, worked as a software engineer, and by his early 30s had accumulated enough invested assets to retire permanently with his family. He was 30 years old when he stopped working for income, and what he calculated and shared with a very large audience was the direct relationship between savings rate and years to retirement. At a 10% savings rate, the math suggests roughly 40 to 45 years to financial independence. Assuming you start from nothing and invest in index funds earning historical market averages, you spend 90 cents of every dollar and save 10. You need a long time. At a 25% savings rate, the timeline drops to roughly 32 years. At a 50% savings rate, it drops to approximately 17 years. At a 75% savings rate, it drops to about 7 years. The numbers are counterintuitive and dramatic. Doubling your savings rate does not halve your time to financial independence. It reduces it by far more, because a higher savings rate affects both sides of the equation simultaneously. You are building your investment portfolio faster, and you are demonstrating that you can live on less, which means the target you are aiming for is smaller. Both the numerator and the denominator are moving in your favor at the same time. There is a man whose story sits quietly behind many of these ideas, and he is perhaps less famous than he should be. His name was Robert Client, and he was a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who came to the same conclusions as many others in the financial independence world, but articulated one particular idea with unusual clarity. Client pointed out that the journey to financial independence does not have to be binary. Most people think of it as you work until you have enough, and then you stop. A cliff at the end of the road. Either you are working or you are retired. But Client proposed something more nuanced, which he called work less, live more. The idea was that partial financial independence is still real and valuable independence. If you have saved enough to cover even 50% of your expenses from your investments, you have cut your dependence on earned income in half. You could work half-time. You could take a lower-paying job you actually enjoy. You could take a year off and then return refreshed. You could weather a layoff without panic. Financial independence in this framing is not a single destination. It is a spectrum. Every increase in your invested assets and every decrease in your required expenses moves you further along that spectrum, giving you more freedom incrementally rather than all at once. This reframing matters enormously for people who feel that full financial independence is an impossible or impractical goal, because the steps toward it, even partial steps, produce real and tangible improvements in freedom. The person who has saved enough to cover 6 months of expenses is meaningfully freer than the person who has saved nothing. The person who has covered 2 years of expenses is freer still. And the person who has covered 10 years of expenses is, in practical terms, in a profoundly different position than the average person living paycheck to paycheck. Progress along the spectrum is always valuable, regardless of whether you ever reach the far end. Let us now meet someone who reached the far end in circumstances that most people would not expect, and whose story carries a different kind of lesson. Her name is Sylvia, and she lived in rural Kentucky. She worked for 32 years as a county clerk, a job that paid modestly and offered a state pension, which itself was not lavish. She raised 2 children largely on her own after her husband left in her mid-30s. She owned a small house with a vegetable garden. She sewed many of her own clothes, She shopped for food at the end of the day when supermarkets marked down their perishables. She drove the same car for 14 years. She did not follow any particular financial independence program. She had not read any books on the subject. What she had was a deep instinctive sense that money spent unnecessarily was freedom postponed. She felt that equation physically, in a way that many people who earn more money never quite develop. When she retired at 65, she had her pension, her Social Security, and a savings account that had accumulated over decades of careful deposits, earning modest interest. She also owned her house outright. Her total monthly income in retirement was somewhat below the national average. But her monthly expenses were even further below, and the gap between her income and her expenses meant she had more discretionary money in retirement than she had ever had during her working years. She traveled. She took up watercolor painting. She visited grandchildren. She described the experience of financial security in retirement as the most surprising gift of her life because she had not set out to achieve it consciously. She had simply for 32 years never spent money she did not need to spend. She is not a dramatic story of early retirement or radical financial engineering. She is the story of the quiet power of a gap between income and expenses, maintained over decades, producing genuine freedom. Now it is worth pausing here as we settle deeper into the night to be clear about something important. This is educational content only, not financial advice. The strategies, numbers, and approaches we discuss tonight are drawn from real research, real books, and real historical experience. But every person's financial situation is different. Tax implications vary by country and circumstance. Investment returns are not guaranteed. The 4% rule is a guideline derived from historical data, not a promise about the future. Any decisions you make about your own money should involve careful research and, where appropriate, consultation with qualified professionals. With that said, let us continue, because the ideas are worth understanding. Clearly, let us talk about what financial independence actually feels like from the inside, because the financial mechanics are only half the story. The other half is psychological, and it is perhaps the more interesting half. Most people, when they imagine financial independence, imagine a specific feeling: relief, the absence of financial anxiety, the sense that the ground beneath you is solid. These are real and meaningful outcomes, but people who have actually achieved financial independence often describe something more nuanced. There is an initial period, frequently reported, of disorientation. When you have organized your entire life around the rhythm of earning and spending, of Monday mornings and Friday paydays and annual reviews, the sudden absence of that rhythm can feel strange. Not unpleasant, but genuinely unfamiliar. Like waking up from a very long dream and not quite knowing what to do with your hands. Vicki Robin, who continued writing and speaking about these ideas for decades after Your Money or Your Life was published, talked about the importance of having a sense of purpose that is not attached to earning. She observed that people who retired purely to escape something, the bad boss, the stressful commute, the soul-crushing meetings, often found retirement less satisfying than they expected. Because escape is not a purpose. It is a direction away from something, not toward something. The people who reported the greatest satisfaction with financial independence were those who had developed a clear sense of what they were running toward: a creative project, a community, a service, a relationship, work they loved that happened to be unpaid. The financial independence was not the destination. It was the clearing of an obstacle between them and what they actually wanted to do with their lives. This distinction between financial independence as a goal and financial independence as a tool is worth holding gently as we continue tonight. There is a concept in the financial independence world called the sequence of returns risk, and it is worth understanding carefully because it is one of the most important practical considerations for anyone approaching the crossover point. Here is the issue. The 4% rule is based on historical averages, but averages hide variation, and in retirement, the order of the returns matters enormously, not just the average. Consider two people who both retire with $1 million and both withdraw $40,000 per year. Both experience an average return of 7% over 30 years. But one of them experiences a severe market downturn in years 1 and 2, and the other experiences the same severe downturn in years 28 and 29. Their outcomes are radically different. The person who faced the downturn early, when their portfolio was largest, is forced to sell more shares at low prices to meet their withdrawals. This depletes their portfolio at the worst possible time, and there are fewer shares left to participate in the eventual recovery. The person who faced the downturn late had decades of growth before the bad years arrived and has a large portfolio buffer to absorb the losses. Same average return, very different outcomes, because the sequence matters. This is why financial independence planning typically involves maintaining some buffer, a year or two of expenses in cash, or short-term bonds that can be drawn on during market downturns without having to sell investments at depressed prices. This reduces the sequence of returns risk by allowing the portfolio time to recover without being depleted by forced sales. It is also why many people who achieve financial independence continue doing some form of work, not because they need the income, but because even small amounts of earned income during the early years of retirement dramatically reduce the portfolio withdrawal rate and therefore the sequence of returns risk. Earning $5,000 per year from a part-time activity you enjoy means withdrawing $35,000 instead of $40,000, a meaningful reduction in the strain on the portfolio. Let us now visit the life of someone who thought very carefully about these questions and whose work has shaped how an entire generation approaches financial independence. John Bogle, whom we met briefly in our previous conversation about compound interest, spent his career making a single argument. But that argument had direct consequences for financial independence that are worth exploring specifically. Bogle argued that ordinary investors were giving away enormous amounts of their potential wealth in fees, that the compounding of those fees over decades amounted to a massive, quiet transfer of wealth from ordinary savers to financial intermediaries, and that the solution was elegant. Buy the whole market through low-cost index funds and stop paying for active management that, by the historical evidence, did not consistently outperform the market anyway. For financial independence seekers, Bogle's contribution was transformative because the 4% rule assumes you are keeping your investment costs very low. If you are paying 1.5% or 2% per year in fund management fees, your effective return is meaningfully lower, and the 4% withdrawal rate becomes riskier. The math that works at low cost becomes strained at high cost. Bogle made low-cost investing accessible. He created Vanguard in 1974 as a shareholder-owned mutual fund company with no incentive to maximize its own profits by charging high fees. The index fund he pioneered, tracking the S&P 500 at a fraction of the cost of actively managed funds, eventually became the most popular investment vehicle in the world. When a person pursuing financial independence invests in a low-cost index fund today, they are benefiting directly from Bogle's life's work. He reduced the friction on the compounding process And that friction reduction translates, over decades, into meaningfully faster progress toward the crossover point. Now, let us talk about something that the financial independence community sometimes calls lifestyle inflation. And that is one of the central psychological challenges on the path. Lifestyle inflation, sometimes called lifestyle creep, refers to the tendency for expenses to rise in parallel with income. You get a raise, your rent increases to something nicer, you upgrade your car, you eat at better restaurants, your clothes become more expensive, your vacations get longer. By the time the higher income has settled into your life, you are spending just as large a percentage of it as you were spending before the raise, and sometimes a larger percentage. This is extremely common. It is, in many ways, the default human response to increased income, and it is the single greatest obstacle to financial independence, because it means that income growth does not translate into savings growth. The gap between income and expenses stays the same or widens in the wrong direction, regardless of how much your earnings improve. The antidote to lifestyle inflation is not deprivation. It is intentionality. The practice of deciding in advance, before the raise arrives, what percentage of it you will save and what percentage you will allow to improve your quality of life. If you get a 10% raise and you decide to save 5% and spend 5%, you get both progress toward financial independence and a genuine quality of life improvement. But you make that decision consciously, before the new money becomes the new normal, rather than discovering 3 months later that the raise has been entirely absorbed by imperceptibly larger expenses. The people who reach financial independence soonest are typically not the people who earn the most. They are the people who allowed the smallest percentage of their income growth to become lifestyle inflation, who banked the raises while keeping their expenses stable, who let the gap between income and expenses grow wider over time rather than staying constant. There is a woman named Liz Thames who wrote about this with unusual candor on a blog called Frugal Woods, and whose story is worth spending some time with because it represents a version of financial independence that many people find more relatable than the software engineer who retires at 30. Liz and her husband Nate were both professionals in Boston, earning good incomes. They liked their city lives. They ate at restaurants. They bought things. They were not unusual. But at some point in their early 30s, they began to examine their expenses carefully. And what they found surprised them. A very large portion of what they were spending did not actually make them happy. It was spending that had accumulated through habit, through convenience, through social comparison, through the ambient pressure of living in an expensive city surrounded by other people spending at similar levels. They were earning to spend, and spending without thinking much about whether the spending was serving their actual values. Over 2 years, they deliberately restructured their expenses. They moved to a rural homestead in Vermont. They grew food. They reduced their spending by a remarkable percentage without, they reported, any corresponding reduction in happiness or life satisfaction. In many ways, their happiness increased because the new life was more aligned with what they had discovered they actually valued, which was nature, community, creative work, and time with each other. Their story is not a template. Not everyone wants a rural homestead in Vermont. Not everyone should move away from a city. The specific choices Liz and Nate made are theirs alone. But the process they went through, the careful examination of what their spending was actually buying in terms of genuine well-being, and the deliberate restructuring that followed, is a process that anyone can apply regardless of their specific circumstances. Financial independence does not require moving to a farm. It requires knowing what you actually value and spending accordingly. Let us now dig into the practical mathematics a little further, because understanding the numbers helps turn the philosophy into a plan. The starting point for any financial independence calculation is your annual expenses, not what you earn, what you spend. This is the number that determines your target, because your target is 25 times your annual expenses. And it is the number that determines your progress, because your savings rate is the gap between what you earn and what you spend. Tracking your annual expenses for the first time often produces surprises. Most people significantly underestimate what they spend. The major categories, rent or mortgage, food, transportation, are usually known, but the accumulation of smaller categories, subscriptions, clothing, personal care, entertainment, gifts, home maintenance, healthcare, often adds up to a figure that is larger than expected. The process of tracking expenses does not need to be onerous. A simple spreadsheet, or any of several apps designed for the purpose, can capture spending categories over the course of a month or two and produce a fairly reliable picture of annual spending. The first time most people do this, they are surprised. The second time, they are more deliberate. Once you know your annual expenses, you can calculate your financial independence number. $40,000 per year in expenses means a target of $1 million. $30,000 means $750,000. $25,000 means $625,000. $50,000 means $1.25 million. Then you can calculate your savings rate. Take your monthly income after taxes, subtract your monthly expenses. What remains is your monthly savings. Divide that by your income. That percentage is your savings rate. And from your savings rate, assuming you are investing those savings in something earning historical average returns, you can estimate your timeline. It is not a precise prediction, because markets are variable and circumstances change, but it is an honest reckoning with where you stand and how long the journey is likely to take. Most people who do this calculation for the first time find it simultaneously sobering and motivating. Sobering because the number is sometimes larger than expected. Motivating because the calculation shows clearly that the outcome is not mysterious or dependent on luck. It is the product of two levers that you control, how much you spend and how much you save, and it moves in response to changes in either of them. Let us talk now about the role of housing in financial independence, because it is typically the single largest expense in most people's budgets, and the decisions made about housing have outsized consequences for the timeline. Housing costs in most developed countries have risen dramatically relative to incomes over the past several decades. The combination of urbanization, population growth in desirable areas, restrictive zoning, low interest rates for an extended period, and various other factors has made housing, particularly in major cities, extremely expensive relative to local incomes. This creates a genuine challenge for financial independence seekers who live in expensive cities. A disproportionate fraction of their income goes to housing. The gap between income and expenses that generates savings is compressed, and the target number, if their lifestyle and therefore expenses are high, is correspondingly larger. There are three broad responses to this challenge. The first is to accept the housing cost and compensate by increasing income and savings in other areas, while also being deliberate about reducing non-housing expenses. The second is to geo-arbitrage, which means earning income in a high-cost city while living in a lower-cost area, either within the same country or internationally. Using remote work to maintain a high income while reducing the primary expense that consumes it, The third is to change the housing situation directly through house hacking, which means buying a multi-unit property and renting out the other units so that the tenants effectively cover or significantly reduce the cost of your own housing. Each of these approaches has genuine real-world examples of people who have made them work. None of them is universally applicable or without trade-offs. But understanding that housing is the lever with the most potential impact on the financial independence timeline helps direct energy toward the right decision. There is a man named Brandon Ganch, known widely online as Mad Fientist, who spent years working as a software engineer while pursuing financial independence and building a body of analytical work about the most efficient paths to the crossover point. One of his most useful contributions was the analysis of tax-advantaged accounts and their role in accelerating financial independence. Tax-advantaged accounts, such as the 401k or the IRA in the United States, the ISA in the United Kingdom, or the RRSP and TFSA in Canada, allow investments to grow either tax-deferred or tax-free. This compounding without the drag of annual taxation can meaningfully accelerate the timeline. Brandon pointed out something that the conventional financial planning community often missed. Traditional financial advisors sometimes discouraged people from contributing to retirement accounts if they planned to retire early, on the grounds that early withdrawals would trigger penalties. But Brandon worked through the rules carefully and found that there were legal pathways, specifically what is called a Roth conversion ladder in the U.S. tax system. That allowed early retirees to access those funds before traditional retirement age without penalties if they planned carefully. The insight was that the tax advantages of these accounts were so significant, particularly for people in their highest earning years, that the complexity of accessing the funds early was worth navigating. The government was essentially offering to boost your savings rate through the gift of tax deferral, and declining that offer in the name of simplicity left significant money on the table. This kind of careful analysis, understanding the specific rules of the system you are operating in, and finding the legal pathways that best serve your goals, is characteristic of the best financial independence thinking. Not gaming the system, not doing anything the least bit dishonest, simply understanding the rules thoroughly enough to use them as they are designed to be used. Let us step back from the technical details for a moment and return to something more fundamental. Because we have been talking about numbers and rules and timelines, and there is a risk of losing sight of why any of this matters. Financial independence is not at its heart about money. It is about time. It is about the freedom to choose how you spend the hours of your life. It is about the removal of a specific kind of coercion, the coercion of needing income in order to survive, from the way you structure your days. This coercion is not evil. It is simply a feature of the economic system we inhabit. Most people need to trade their time for money in order to afford their lives. That is a reality that financial independence seeks to change, not by changing the economic system, but by accumulating enough capital that the coercion no longer applies to you personally. And the people who have achieved this, the ones who have reached their crossover point and live on investment income, describe the change in their experience of time as qualitatively different from what they expected. Not just more of it, different, uncompressed, unhurried, available to be spent on things that matter to them rather than on things they are required to do. Joe Dominguez spent his free decades on music and community work. Vicki Robin spent hers on writing and environmental advocacy. Peter Abney spent his building one of the most read personal finance websites in the world and raising his son. Liz Thames spent hers on a farm in Vermont, writing and farming and being present. Each of them found a different answer to the question of what to do with the time, but all of them had the time to ask the question properly, which is perhaps the deepest gift of financial independence. There is a story from the history of the labor movement that is rarely told in finance conversations, but that belongs in this one. In the early 20th century, the standard work week in most industrialized countries was 60 to 70 hours, 6 or 7 days. Workers worked long hours, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was not working and therefore not eating. The labor movement fought for decades, through strikes and legislation and considerable social struggle, to establish the 8-hour day and the 5-day work week. The person most associated with codifying the 40-hour work week into American law was Henry Ford, who made the change at his own factories in 1926. Not primarily out of altruism, but because he had determined through practical observation that workers who had leisure time were better workers, and also better consumers. Workers who were not exhausted made fewer mistakes. Workers who had weekends, went to the movies, bought products, participated in an economy of leisure that was itself a source of industrial demand. The 40-hour work week was a negotiated settlement between the need of capitalism for productive labor and the basic human need for time. It was not a natural law. It was a social agreement arrived at through considerable struggle that has shaped every working life since. Financial independence is in some sense the personal extension of that same negotiation. Where labor movements sought to reduce the hours required of workers collectively, financial independence seeks to reduce the hours required individually by accumulating enough capital that the individual no longer needs to exchange their time for money. It is not a political statement. It is not an argument for or against labor unions or for or against capitalism. It is simply the observation that if the structure of the economy requires you to spend a certain portion of your life earning money, and if you can change your personal situation so that less of your life is consumed by that requirement, more of your life is available for other things. And that availability is worth something. Worth quite a lot, actually. Let us talk now about something that tends to derail many financial independence journeys before they fully begin. And that is the question of what the people around you think. Money, in most cultures, is deeply social. How you spend money is a signal of status, of belonging, of identity. The car you drive, the neighborhood you live in, the restaurants you eat at, the clothes you wear, the vacations you take, all of these are visible indicators of where you stand economically and socially. And in a culture that equates spending with success, the decision to spend deliberately and carefully can feel like a social risk. The financial independence community has thought carefully about this. The phrase that circulates most often is attributed to Robert Kiyosaki, but has appeared in various forms in the broader conversation. Most people spend money they do not have, to buy things they do not need, to impress people they do not like. That is a slightly harsh formulation, but it contains an important observation about the social mechanism that drives much consumer spending. The car you drive to impress your neighbors is being paid for with money that would otherwise be compounding toward your freedom. The renovation you made to your kitchen because your colleague just renovated hers is competing with the savings rate that determines when you can stop worrying about money permanently. None of this means living poorly or denying yourself genuine pleasures. It means being honest about which of your spending is driven by genuine desire and which is driven by social comparison. And being honest about the cost, in time, in freedom, in the hours of your life it represents, of the spending that is primarily performative. The people who reach financial independence fastest are typically not the ones who deny themselves everything. They are the ones who have developed a very clear sense of what actually brings them genuine satisfaction, and who are willing to be indifferent to spending that does not meet that standard. They are not minimalists by ideology. They are minimalists by design, having designed their lives around what they actually value, rather than around what they think they should value. There is an aspect of financial independence that is almost never discussed in mainstream financial coverage, and that is its relationship with risk. Specifically, the way that financial independence reduces your exposure to the various risks that make ordinary economic life precarious. Consider what financial independence means in the face of a job loss. For a person without savings, job loss is a crisis. It triggers immediate financial pressure, which creates emotional pressure, which affects decision-making quality, which can lead to accepting the first available job rather than the best available job. The urgency of need narrows options. For a person with substantial savings, job loss is an inconvenience at worst. They have time to evaluate their options carefully, to look for a role that genuinely fits, to negotiate from a position of calm rather than desperation. The financial cushion does not just provide money. It provides the psychological freedom to make better decisions. Consider health. A person who cannot afford to stop working cannot easily accommodate a health issue that requires rest or recovery time. Financial independence, or even progress toward it, creates the capacity to step back from work when health requires it, without the compounding anxiety of income loss. Consider relationships. Financial stress is one of the most commonly cited contributors to relationship difficulties and breakups. Couples who fight about money, who feel trapped by financial obligations they resent, who are under constant pressure from insufficient funds, are statistically more likely to experience relationship difficulties. Financial security does not guarantee relationship harmony, but the removal of financial stress removes one significant source of friction from intimate relationships. The freedom that financial independence provides is not just the freedom to spend time differently. It is the freedom to make better decisions under pressure, because the pressure itself is reduced or eliminated. Let us visit another real story, because stories carry truth in ways that numbers cannot always manage. There was a couple in Portland, Oregon, both teachers, who spent their early careers building up their savings slowly and without any particular strategy beyond the instinct that saving was wise. They contributed to their retirement accounts. They paid off their mortgage early. They drove modest cars. They took camping vacations rather than resort vacations, not because they could not afford otherwise, but because they genuinely preferred the outdoors. In 2009, during the depths of the financial crisis, the school district where they both worked faced severe budget cuts. Many of their colleagues were laid off. Both of them survived the cuts, but it was a close thing, and the experience shook them. They watched friends and colleagues scramble, suddenly without income, unable to meet mortgage payments, liquidating retirement savings at the worst possible moment when markets were down. The teachers were frightened, but they were not desperate because they had 10 years of living expenses sitting in their investment accounts, and their house was paid for. The crisis was uncomfortable for them emotionally, as it was for almost everyone, but it was not existential. They had time and resources to wait it out. After the crisis passed, they began reading more intentionally about financial independence, and they realized that they were already most of the way there. They had been practicing the principles without knowing they had principles. Within 3 years, they had crossed the crossover point, not dramatically or triumphantly, but quietly, in the way that a long process of accumulation eventually reaches completion. They both continued teaching because they loved it for several more years, but the quality of their teaching changed when they were no longer financially dependent on the job. They stopped managing difficult situations with one eye on job security. They took more creative risks in their classrooms. They advocated for students in ways they might previously have hesitated to, out of concern about administrative displeasure. Financial independence made them better at their jobs because the financial independence removed the distortion that financial dependency creates. We should spend some time now on what the financial independence community calls the spending side of the equation, because there is an entire universe of practical strategies here that is worth exploring with care. The most fundamental insight is that frugality is not the same as deprivation. Frugality, properly understood, is the art of extracting maximum value from every dollar spent. It is the opposite of waste, and it is compatible with a rich and satisfying life. The Japanese concept of motenai captures something related to this. Motenai is an expression of regret at waste. It encompasses the idea of using things fully before discarding them, of repairing rather than replacing, of valuing the intrinsic usefulness of an object rather than its novelty or status signal. It is a cultural value that sits in interesting contrast to the deliberately rapid obsolescence of much modern consumer culture. Practical frugality takes many forms, and the specific forms that make sense depend entirely on individual circumstances. But some general principles emerge from the financial independence literature with unusual consistency. The first is to distinguish between wants and needs with genuine honesty, not as a moral judgment, but as a practical exercise. Some wants are so deeply aligned with your genuine values that they are effectively needs. Others, on examination, turn out to be reflexive rather than genuinely desired. The second is to look at the large categories first. Housing and transportation together typically represent 50 to 60% of household expenses. Small savings on lattes are not insignificant, but they are dwarfed by the impact of decisions about where you live and what you drive. Optimizing the large categories first and working down is the most efficient approach. The third is to distinguish between one-time and recurring costs. A subscription that costs $15 per month costs $180 per year, and invested rather than spent at a modest return over 10 years costs roughly $2,500 in lost compounding. Recurring costs have outsized impact precisely because they recur, and because the money they consume cannot compound. The fourth is to reduce the friction of good decisions and increase the friction of impulsive ones. Automatic savings transfers, set up to move money into investments the moment your paycheck arrives, remove the need to exercise willpower every month. The money is gone before you see it. Conversely, adding small obstacles to impulsive spending, even something as simple as deleting shopping apps from your phone, reduces the frequency of unconsidered purchases. There is a concept that runs through the financial independence literature that deserves careful examination, and it is the concept of enough. This is perhaps the deepest and most philosophical element of the entire framework. Most conventional economic thinking assumes that more is always better. More income, more consumption, more status goods. The marginal utility of money, the additional satisfaction provided by each additional dollar, is assumed to be positive. And while it does diminish with increasing wealth, the conventional assumption is that it never quite reaches zero. There is always something more you could buy, some better version of something you already have, some experience you have not yet had. The concept of enough rejects this assumption, or at least complicates it. It suggests that there is a point at which additional material consumption provides diminishing returns, and that beyond that point, the additional time and effort required to earn more money costs more in experiential terms than the additional consumption provides in satisfaction. This is not an ascetic or anti-consumption argument. It is a practical observation about the relationship between income, consumption, and life satisfaction. Research in positive psychology, particularly the work of Daniel Kahneman and others on the relationship between income and happiness, suggests that beyond a certain income threshold, which varies by geography and personal circumstance, but is typically in the moderate middle income range for most developed countries, additional income has diminishing effects on day-to-day emotional well-being. The people who reach financial independence earliest are often those who have found their enough point earliest, who discovered, through experience or reflection, that their genuine life satisfaction did not require constant upward revision of their consumption, who found that the quality of their relationships, the engagement of their activities, and the time they had available mattered more to them than the size of their house or the newness of their car. Finding your enough point is not a moral achievement. It is a practical discovery. And making that discovery earlier rather than later has substantial consequences for the timeline to financial independence. Let us now talk about income, because we have spent considerable time on the spending side and the investment side, and income is the third leg of the stool. The financial independence literature sometimes has a reputation for being intensely focused on frugality and cutting costs, and for being somewhat dismissive of income as a lever. This is an overemphasis on one side of the equation. Income matters. Increasing income at the same expense level directly increases the savings rate and therefore accelerates the timeline. The most straightforward way to increase income is through career advancement in your primary job. Developing skills that are valued by employers and markets. Becoming excellent at your work. Positioning yourself strategically within your organization and industry, and negotiating effectively for compensation are all legitimate and important strategies. But the financial independence community has also explored what are sometimes called side hustles, which is a somewhat inelegant term for secondary income streams. These can take many forms: freelance work in a professional skill, a small business, renting a spare room or parking space, creating digital content, teaching or tutoring, selling crafts or goods. The specific form matters less than the principle. Additional income at a stable expense level goes directly into the savings rate. There is also a concept called building income streams that do not require your time, sometimes called passive income. Though the word passive is somewhat misleading because almost all income of this kind requires initial effort. Rental property requires property acquisition, management, and maintenance. A blog or YouTube channel requires years of content creation before it generates significant income. A book requires writing. An online course requires building. But the point is that these income streams, once established, continue to generate income with less ongoing time per dollar than traditional employment. And for financial independence seekers, the appeal is obvious. Income that continues without proportionate time investment is income that supports the goal of replacing employment income eventually. There is a couple whose story represents perhaps the most dramatic version of income building on the path to financial independence, and whose work has had an outsized influence on how the broader community thinks about these questions. Justin and Kaisorn McCurry, who blogged under the name Root of Good, both had professional careers, Justin as an engineer and Kaisorn as a social worker, and both contributed to their retirement accounts for years while keeping their expenses moderate. But their particular insight was about geographic arbitrage, specifically about how much further their money went when they lived in a mid-sized Southern American city rather than in a coastal metropolis. They retired at the age of 33 with a portfolio of approximately $1.3 million and 3 children which sounds like a very large number until you calculate their annual expenses, which were approximately around $32,000 per year for the entire family. At 4%, $1.3 million produces about $52,000 per year, well above their expenses. How did they keep expenses so low with 3 children? Partly through deliberate lifestyle choices, partly through living in an area with a lower cost of living than major coastal cities, partly through skills, cooking at home, doing their own home repairs, growing some of their own food, and partly through a deeply considered sense of what genuinely enriched their family life versus what was spending for its own sake. Their story is sometimes criticized as extreme or as applicable only to high earners. And it is true that their engineering salaries gave them an advantage, but the principle they demonstrated, that the expense level matters as much as the income level in determining the path to financial independence, holds regardless of income. The person who earns $50,000 and spends $30,000 is on a faster path than the person who earns $100,000 and spends $90,000, even though the latter earns twice as much. As we move deeper into the night, let us talk about something that exists at the intersection of financial independence and the broader question of what a good life looks like. Because the financial independence journey, properly undertaken, is not just a financial project, it is a values clarification project. When you begin tracking your expenses and comparing them to what you actually value, you inevitably confront questions that are not financial at all. What do I actually enjoy? What kind of work gives me genuine satisfaction, regardless of whether it pays well? What relationships do I want to invest in? What kind of community do I want to be part of? What does a day feel like that I feel genuinely grateful for? These questions are not usually answered in finance books, but they are the questions that financial independence is ultimately in service of. Because financial independence without any sense of what you are going to do with the freedom it creates can feel oddly empty. The goal is the freedom, but freedom to do what? Vicki Robin talked about this as the question of life energy. Not just where is your money going, but where is your life going? What are you doing with the hours that you have? What will you have spent them on when you look back from the end? This is not meant to be a heavy or anxious question. It is meant to be a joyful one. The process of building toward financial independence is also, ideally, a process of building toward a life that you actually want. Each reduction in expenses that does not reduce your genuine satisfaction is a clarification of what you actually value. Each investment that grows while you sleep is a vote for a future in which your time is your own. There is a philosopher named Seneca who lived in 1st century Rome, who was a wealthy man, a tutor to emperors, and a profound thinker about the nature of time and how we use it. He wrote, in his essay on the shortness of life, that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. He was writing for a Roman audience 2,000 years ago, but his observation lands with uncomfortable accuracy in the contemporary world. The average person in a modern developed country spends an extraordinary portion of their waking hours on activities they did not choose. In exchange for money, they spend on things that do not make them significantly happier. Seneca's prescription was to live deliberately, to use time as if it mattered, because it does, because it is finite, because the hours spent are gone forever. He was not arguing for laziness or the avoidance of meaningful work. He was arguing for consciousness, for the practice of deciding, rather than drifting, how your hours are spent. Financial independence is, in this framing, a practical implementation of Seneca's advice. It is the construction of a financial architecture that gives you the option to spend your time as Seneca would have recommended, on what matters to you, chosen consciously, not assigned by the necessity of earning. The Stoics, the philosophical school to which Seneca belonged, also believed in something they called negative visualization, the practice of imagining what your life would be like without the things you currently have, not as a morbid exercise, but as a way of cultivating gratitude and preventing the hedonic adaptation that causes us to take our advantages for granted. In a financial context, negative visualization might mean imagining life without financial security, which most people find genuinely uncomfortable, and allowing that discomfort to motivate the building of it. Let us come now toward the end of this long, quiet journey and do what all good journeys deserve: a slow look back at the terrain we have covered. We began with Joe Dominguez, the Wall Street analyst who retired at 31 and spent the rest of his life on what he actually valued. We learned that money is life energy, compressed and made storable, and that every purchase is an exchange of finite time. We discovered the 4% rule and the number 25, which together form the mathematical backbone of financial independence planning. We explored the savings rate and its counterintuitive relationship with the timeline, and we saw that the person who saves 50% of their income reaches independence in roughly half the time of the person who saves 25%. We spent time with Robert Clyott and the idea of partial independence, the spectrum of freedom that grows incrementally rather than arriving all at once. We visited Sylvia in rural Kentucky, who arrived at financial security through instinct and deliberate frugality over 32 years of modestly paid work. We understood the sequence of returns risk and why the order of market returns matters as much as their average. We traveled with Liz Thames to a farm in Vermont where she discovered that her genuine values had been distorted by the ambient pressure of an expensive city, and that restructuring her life around what she actually valued produced more satisfaction on less money. We explored lifestyle inflation, the silent killer of savings rates, and the practice of deciding in advance what to do with a raise before the raise becomes the new normal. We spent time with John Bogle and the power of low-cost investing, and with Brandon Ganch's careful analysis of how to maximize the tax advantages available to financial independence seekers. We talked about housing, the largest expense lever, and the various strategies for managing it. We discussed income, the importance of building it actively, rather than treating frugality as the only tool available. And we made time for something that the numbers alone cannot provide: the philosophical context, Joe Dominguez and Vicki Robin, and their concept of life energy, Seneca and the shortness of life, and the practice of living deliberately, the question of enough and what genuine satisfaction actually requires. Financial independence is a patient idea. It does not reward urgency or impatience. It rewards exactly the same qualities that compound interest rewards: consistency, time, and the discipline to not interrupt a process that is working. There is a paradox at the center of it that is worth sitting with as the night settles. The fastest path to financial independence is also the path that most clearly reveals what you actually value. Because the process of reducing unnecessary spending and increasing savings forces you to distinguish, repeatedly and honestly, between what genuinely enriches your life and what does not. And the people who reach financial independence fastest are typically the people who are clearest about that distinction. But here is the paradox. When you are genuinely clear about what you value, and when you have structured your life around those values, the urgency to reach financial independence sometimes diminishes. Because the life you are already living, the deliberate and intentional and values-aligned life on the path to independence, is already a good one. The destination remains important, but the journey stops being something to endure and becomes something to live. This is perhaps the deepest secret of financial independence, that the practice of building it, the values clarification, the deliberate spending, the conscious investment, the patience, is itself a version of the freedom it promises. Not the full version, not yet, but a genuine and growing version of it. Joe Dominguez understood this. He lived it for decades. Ronald Reed, the janitor from Vermont we met in our conversation about compound interest, lived it unconsciously, but completely. Sylvia in Kentucky lived it through instinct. And the teachers in Portland lived it while building something they did not know to call by its name. All of them found the same thing, that freedom, built slowly and deliberately and patiently, is worth every hour it takes to construct. That the clock that is running on your compounding investments is the same clock that is running on your life, and that starting now, with what you have, is the only beginning that is actually available to you. The night has been long and the ideas have been many, but they all circle back to the same simple, patient, profound observation. Your money is your life energy made tangible. Your time is finite and irreplaceable. The gap between what you earn and what you spend is the seed of your future freedom. And the future freedom, once built, opens a space in which you can finally ask, without the distortion of financial necessity, what do I actually want to do with the time I have? That question, asked clearly and answered honestly, is the real return on the investment. And yet, to answer it well, we need to understand where the idea of financial independence itself came from, because it is not a modern invention, and its history reveals something important about what it has always meant to human beings. Financial independence, understood properly, is a lens through which the entire relationship between human beings and economic systems becomes clearer and more interesting. And some of the most illuminating stories in its history come from unexpected places. Let us talk about the history of the idea itself, because financial independence is not a modern invention. The desire to reach a point where your assets generate enough income to sustain your life without further labor is as old as the concept of assets itself. The landed gentry of medieval and early modern Europe had a version of it. Land that produced rents was the original passive income. A nobleman who owned enough productive farmland did not need to work. The rents arrived. The tenants did the labor. The landowner had his income without his personal effort. This was financial independence through property, and it was the organizing principle of aristocratic society for centuries. What changed with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern financial markets was the democratization of this idea. Before public markets, you needed land or title or hereditary wealth to have assets that generated passive income. After the creation of joint stock companies, bond markets, and eventually mutual funds and index funds, the mechanism became accessible to anyone with a surplus to invest. This is a genuinely remarkable historical development. The ability to own a fractional piece of a productive enterprise, to receive a share of its profits, to watch the value of your ownership stake grow as the enterprise grows, was for most of human history available only to those who could afford to start or acquire a complete business. Now it is available to anyone who can put $100 into a brokerage account. The financial independence movement is, in this sense, a movement that takes the democratization of capital ownership seriously. It asks, if these tools are available to everyone, and if they work as well as the historical record suggests, why do so few people use them deliberately toward the goal of genuine financial freedom? The answer, at least in part, lies in education, or rather, in its absence. Most people in most countries receive no formal education in personal finance. They leave school understanding how to calculate the area of a triangle and memorizing the dates of historical battles, without understanding how compound interest works, what an index fund is, what a savings rate means for their future, or how the relationship between their income and their expenses determines the trajectory of their financial life. This is a genuine and consequential gap, because the decisions that matter most to a person's long-term financial well-being, decisions about savings, about investing, about debt, about housing, about spending patterns, are made throughout adult life, usually without any formal framework. People navigate these decisions through a combination of what their parents modeled, what their peers do, what advertisers encourage them to do, and occasional fragments of financial information absorbed from media or conversation. The result is that most people's financial lives reflect the ambient culture around them, rather than a considered and informed strategy. In a consumer culture that celebrates spending, most people spend most of what they earn. In a culture that associates expensive things with status and success, most people spend money on expensive things. In a world where financial complexity is often used to obscure rather than illuminate, most people feel confused and somewhat passive about their financial futures. Financial independence is, among other things, a call to deliberateness, to education, to the kind of informed agency that comes from understanding the rules of the game well enough to play it intentionally, rather than being carried along by it. There is a school of thought within the financial independence community that has developed around what is sometimes called value-based spending. And it is worth exploring carefully because it offers a more nuanced and livable version of the frugality concept than the stereotype of extreme penny pinching. Value-based spending does not ask you to spend as little as possible. It asks you to spend intentionally, to direct your money toward the things that genuinely enrich your life and away from the things that do not, regardless of whether the things that enrich your life are expensive or cheap. For one person, this might mean spending generously on travel, because exploration and new experiences are genuinely central to their sense of a life well lived, while spending almost nothing on clothes, because the variety of their wardrobe is not something they care about. For another person, it might mean spending generously on food and cooking, because gathering people around a table and feeding them is a source of deep, genuine satisfaction, while spending modestly on entertainment, because their richest pleasures are homemade. The point is not the amount spent in any given category. The point is the alignment between spending and genuine values, and the practice of building that alignment, of asking honestly what actually brings me satisfaction and what does not, is both a financial practice and a life practice. A useful exercise, borrowed from the financial independence community, is to rate your recent purchases on a scale of fulfillment, not satisfaction in the moment of purchase, which is often inflated by novelty and desire, but genuine ongoing fulfillment. The things that continue to bring value days or weeks or months after the purchase represent your genuine values in spending. The things that felt exciting at the moment of purchase but have been forgotten or rarely used represent spending that was not aligned with genuine values. This exercise, repeated over time, builds a remarkably accurate map of what your money actually buys in terms of well-being versus what you think it buys or what advertising tells you it should buy. There's a man named Jacob Lund Fisker who approached financial independence from a direction somewhat different from most of the community, and whose work deserves its own chapter in this story. Fisker was a Danish astrophysicist who came to the United States to work in academia, found the academic life not quite right for his temperament, and at some point began thinking about financial independence with the rigor of a scientist. He achieved financial independence at the age of 33 on an income that was notably modest by American professional standards, and the book he wrote about it, called Early Retirement Extreme, published in 2010, is one of the most intellectually rigorous texts in the genre. What Fisker emphasized, more than most of the financial independence literature, was the concept of skills. Specifically, the idea that reducing your dependence on the market economy for meeting your needs was itself a form of financial independence strategy. Every skill you develop, cooking rather than eating out, repairing rather than replacing, building rather than buying, reduces the dollar amount your lifestyle requires, and therefore reduces the size of the portfolio you need to sustain it. Fisker described the ideal financial independence practitioner as a Renaissance person in the classical sense, someone who had developed competence across a broad range of practical domains, rather than specializing narrowly in one high-income skill and outsourcing everything else. This is a somewhat countercultural idea in a society organized around specialization and comparative advantage, where the standard advice is to specialize in your highest value skill and buy everything else. But Fisker argued that the standard advice created a kind of fragility, a deep dependence on the market for everything. That was itself a form of unfreedom. A person who can grow some of their own food, repair their own home, maintain their own vehicle, cook most of their own meals, and meet many of their own practical needs is less dependent on income than a person who outsources all of these things to the market, even if the market-dependent person earns considerably more. The skills reduce the cost of the life, which reduces the portfolio needed to fund it, which moves the crossover point closer. Let us now spend some time with the question of investing strategy for financial independence, because the principles here are important and often misunderstood. The investment strategy most commonly recommended in the financial independence community is deliberately simple: low-cost, broadly diversified index funds, stocks of companies across the entire market, or a large portion of it, held continuously and without trading, with dividends reinvested automatically. This simplicity is not a concession to lack of sophistication. It is the product of a great deal of sophistication, the conclusion reached by decades of financial research. The research consistently shows that over long periods, the returns of passive index investing exceed the returns of most actively managed investment approaches after accounting for costs. And the research shows this not because passive investors are smarter or luckier, but because the absence of fees and trading costs and the mistakes of market timing gives them a consistent mathematical advantage. For the financial independence investor, the specific allocation between stocks and bonds matters and should be considered carefully in light of individual circumstances, time horizons, and risk tolerance. Common recommendations in the community include 3 fund portfolios, typically a combination of domestic stocks, international stocks, and bonds, held in proportions that reflect the investor's time horizon and comfort with volatility. What all the serious researchers and practitioners in this space agree on is the primacy of low cost. A fund that charges 2% per year in fees requires meaningfully higher gross returns to produce the same net result as a fund charging 0.1%. Over a 20-year financial independence journey, the compounding of that fee difference is substantial. The fund selection decision that might seem minor at the outset is actually one of the most consequential decisions in the entire strategy. There is something that financial independence communities refer to as the one more year syndrome, and it is worth naming and understanding because it represents one of the most common failure modes of people who are close to achieving their goal. One more year syndrome describes the tendency of people who have nearly reached financial independence to delay actually making the transition. They are at their crossover point. Their investments generate enough passive income to fund their life. But they do not stop. Instead, they tell themselves they will work just one more year to have a bigger cushion, a larger buffer, a more comfortable margin of safety. One more year passes, and they work. One more year again, and again. There are legitimate reasons to continue working after reaching financial independence. If you genuinely love your work, if your work provides social connection and purpose, that would be difficult to replicate otherwise. If there is a specific project or achievement you want to complete, these are valid reasons to keep going. But one more year syndrome, at its pathological extreme, is driven by anxiety rather than genuine desire. It is driven by the fear that the numbers are wrong, that the market will crash, that expenses will rise unexpectedly, that the cushion is insufficient, and that fear can paradoxically prevent people from ever claiming the freedom they spent years building. The antidote is usually some combination of genuinely detailed planning for the post-independence life, realistic stress testing of the financial plan under adverse scenarios, and the recognition that financial independence is not irreversible. If your expenses genuinely exceed your investment returns for an extended period, you can return to some form of earned income. The safety net is not as thin as anxiety makes it feel. The people who have made the transition successfully and describe it with the most satisfaction are typically those who had done both the financial planning and the life planning, who knew not just that they could afford to stop, but what they were stopping for. Let us visit the question of what comes after financial independence, because for most people, the journey occupies so much attention that the destination remains somewhat vague. The most common discovery of people who have reached financial independence, reported across the literature and across personal blogs and in interviews, is that the transition requires a period of adjustment. The structure that work provided, the social connections, the sense of purpose, the rhythm of days organized around tasks and colleagues and deadlines does not automatically replace itself. Some people find the adjustment easy. They had projects and relationships and interests that immediately expanded to fill the available time, and the transition felt like a welcome opening. Others find it more challenging. They had defined themselves partly through their professional roles, and without those roles, they experience a period of identity reorientation that is genuine and sometimes uncomfortable. Neither outcome is a failure. The adjustment period, for those who experience it, is simply the time it takes for a life organized around earning to reorganize itself around something else. And what something else means varies enormously. Community service, creative work, learning, travel, deeper engagement with relationships, raising children, physical pursuits, building things, growing things. The people who report the most satisfaction in early retirement or financial independence consistently have several things in common. They have maintained social connections and built new ones. They have found ways to contribute to something beyond themselves. They have maintained physical health, and they have allowed their definition of what constitutes a meaningful day to evolve. Rather than importing the productivity standards of their working lives directly into their free time, financial independence is the opening of a door. What you walk into on the other side is the work that no one else can do for you. There is a practice within the financial independence community called the annual review, or sometimes the FI check-in, and it is worth describing because it encapsulates the ongoing nature of the journey. Once per year, practitioners typically review several things: their net worth, the total value of their assets minus their debts, their savings rate over the year, what percentage of their income did they actually save, their expense categories, where did the money actually go, and does that reflect their values, their investment performance, how did the portfolio do relative to benchmarks and expectations, and their progress toward their financial independence number. How many years of expenses can their portfolio now support? This annual review serves several purposes. It provides accountability and measurement, making the invisible progress of compounding visible and concrete. It provides an opportunity to course correct, identifying spending patterns that have drifted from intention or savings rates that have declined. It provides motivation, because seeing the numbers move in the right direction, even slowly, reinforces the practice. But perhaps most importantly, it provides an opportunity to revisit the question of what the goal actually is. Financial independence numbers are not fixed. Circumstances change. Values evolve. A life that required $60,000 per year in expenses might, 10 years later, require only $40,000, or might have expanded to $80,000, depending on what happened during those years. The annual review is a chance to recalibrate the target and the strategy in light of current reality, rather than planning assumptions made years earlier. Let us spend a few moments with the question of children and financial independence, because it is a significant complication that the literature does not always address with sufficient seriousness. Children are expensive. In the United States, estimates of the cost of raising a child from birth to 18 have ranged from $170,000 to nearly $300,000, depending on income level and location. This number does not include higher education. It does not include anything that happens after 18. It represents a substantial and sustained commitment of resources that significantly affects the financial independence timeline. And yet, many of the most prominent figures in the financial independence world have children. Peter Adeney has a son. Justin and Kaisorn McCurry have 3 children. Liz Thames has children. The financial independence community is not a child-free community, though the mathematics are unambiguously easier without the expense of children. What these families have demonstrated is that financial independence with children requires, more than most things, a clear-eyed accounting of the total costs involved and a long-term saving strategy that explicitly incorporates those costs. It may require a longer timeline. It may require a higher income. It may require more creative approaches to education, housing, and childcare costs. But it is not incompatible with the goal. It is simply a complication that requires honest incorporation into the plan, rather than avoidance. And for many people, the desire to model financial deliberateness for their children, to give them an example of a life organized around genuine values and long-term thinking, rather than short-term consumption, is itself a motivation for pursuing financial independence. The financial habits children observe in their parents are among the most powerful financial educations they will receive. There is a final dimension of this story that we have not yet fully explored, and it is, perhaps, the most intimate. It is the question of what financial independence means for the relationship between people and their work. For many people who reach financial independence, the relationship with work does not end. It transforms. The coercion is removed, which changes the experience of work entirely, even when the work itself is the same. A financial advisor who no longer needs the income from her practice discovers that she can advise clients differently, more honestly, without the pressure of maintaining a revenue relationship. A teacher who no longer needs the paycheck takes more creative risks in the classroom and advocates more boldly for his students. A writer who no longer needs to write for commercial markets writes the book she actually wanted to write rather than the book she calculated would sell. The work continues, but its quality often improves because it is now chosen rather than compelled. The person who works from freedom rather than necessity brings a different quality of attention and engagement to what they do. They are not managing their behavior in light of financial fear. They are doing the work for the reasons the work itself warrants. This transformation from compelled work to chosen work is perhaps the most profound change that financial independence produces. And it is one that cannot be reduced to a spreadsheet or a savings rate or a portfolio balance. It is a change in the interior experience of being a working person in the world. Let us now talk about something that the financial independence community has grappled with in recent years as the movement has grown and diversified. It is the question of privilege and access, and it deserves a careful and honest treatment. The criticism goes like this: financial independence is easy to preach when you are a high-income earner. When you make $200,000 per year, saving 50% is uncomfortable but possible. When you make $30,000 per year, there may be nothing left to save after rent, food, utilities, transportation, and basic health care. The mathematics of financial independence that seem empowering at high incomes become almost cruel as a prescription for low-income households. This criticism has genuine validity. Financial independence in the form described by the most prominent voices in the community, early retirement by the mid-30s or 40s, is not accessible to everyone. It is more accessible to people with high incomes, to people in certain professions, to people without significant health challenges or caregiving responsibilities, and to people in countries with robust public safety nets. But there is a version of the underlying philosophy that holds across income levels, and it is worth naming clearly. The idea that the gap between income and expenses matters more than income alone. The idea that understanding where your money goes gives you agency over your financial future that you did not have before. The idea that beginning to save even a small amount starts a compounding process that is better than no process at all. The idea that financial literacy itself is a form of empowerment regardless of where you are on the income spectrum. A person earning $30,000 per year who saves $3,010% is on a different financial trajectory than a person earning the same amount who saves nothing. The timeline to financial independence may be very long. The target may require flexibility and creativity, but the direction is the same, and the understanding is the same, and the agency that comes with deliberate financial choices is the same. Financial independence is most easily achieved by those with high incomes, but the principles that make it possible are available to everyone, and those principles, applied consistently and over time, always move a person in a better direction. There is a concept worth naming here that connects the financial independence journey to broader questions of community and interdependence. It is the concept of what is sometimes called enough and then some. Some of the people who have reached financial independence describe a phase that follows the initial period of adjustment and exploration, a phase in which the question of what to do with freedom expands beyond personal fulfillment to include contribution. The work they feel drawn to is not just creative or pleasurable, but oriented outward toward the communities and people around them. Joe Dominguez spent his post-retirement decades in community organizing and in helping to develop the Your Money or Your Life framework that has influenced hundreds of thousands of people. Vicki Robin followed similar paths, adding environmental advocacy to her work. Grace Groner's entire legacy was her gift to her college. The teachers from Portland began volunteering extensively in their local school system after they no longer needed its paychecks. this outward turn is not inevitable. Not everyone who reaches financial independence feels drawn to contribution. Some are content with deeply personal and private pleasures, and that is entirely legitimate. But the frequency with which people who have achieved financial independence describe a pull toward contribution suggests that the freedom created by financial independence tends to surface genuine values. And for many people, contribution to others is among the most genuine of those values. The financial independence journey, at its best, does not produce people who have withdrawn from society. It produces people who have re-entered it on their own terms, with the freedom to contribute in the ways that most align with who they actually are. We should take a moment to talk about the role of community in sustaining the financial independence journey, because it is underemphasized in most descriptions of the path, but matters enormously in practice. The ambient culture of most developed consumer societies is organized around the assumption that spending is normal, spending is enjoyable, spending is what successful people do. Advertisements, social media, peer behavior, the physical design of cities and shopping centers, all of these push in the same direction. Buy more, spend more, have more, be more. Pursuing financial independence within this cultural context requires swimming against a current, not dramatically or self-righteously, not in a way that alienates friends or makes family gatherings uncomfortable, but with a consistent interior resistance to the default assumptions about what a good life costs. This is considerably easier when you have community, when there are other people around you who share a similar orientation toward money and time. People who are also tracking their savings rate, also resisting lifestyle inflation, also finding genuine satisfaction in lower-cost pleasures, also invested in a long-term project of financial freedom. This is part of why the online communities around financial independence, the forums, the blogs, the podcasts, the social media groups have been so important to the movement. They provide a community of shared values that counterbalances the ambient cultural pressure. They normalize a way of living that the broader culture treats as unusual or extreme. And they provide both accountability and inspiration through the stories and numbers of people who are on the same path. Finding or building that community, whether online or in person, is not a luxury for financial independence pursuers. It is one of the most practical things you can do to sustain the journey through the flat part of the hockey stick, when the rewards are invisible and the cultural pressure to stop is constant. There is a man who deserves a place in this conversation, who is rarely mentioned alongside the more prominent figures in the financial independence world, perhaps because his methods were so simple that they seem almost too plain to discuss. His name was William Nickerson, and he was an American investor who in 1959 published a book called How I Turned $1,000 into $5 million in Real Estate. Nickerson was not a genius or a celebrity. He was a former telephone company employee in San Francisco who had methodically purchased, improved, and managed small residential properties over several decades. His book, which detailed the specific techniques he used, was one of the first widely read guides to building financial independence through real estate. What Nickerson understood was that real estate, like stocks, could compound if managed intelligently. A property purchased cheaply, improved carefully, and rented at a fair market rate generated income. That income, reinvested into more properties, generated more income. The leverage available through mortgages amplified both the returns and the risks. And over decades of patient management, the compounding of rental income and property appreciation could produce a portfolio worth many times the initial investment. Real estate as a path to financial independence has different characteristics than stock market investing. It requires more active management. It requires dealing with tenants and maintenance and vacancy. It involves more concentrated risk, since a single property represents a large portion of the portfolio rather than the diversification of thousands of companies in an index fund. And it requires more initial capital, since properties cannot typically be purchased for $100. But for people who have the aptitude and patience for it, real estate has been one of the most reliable paths to financial independence throughout the modern era. The combination of rental income, mortgage paid down by tenants, and long-term appreciation creates multiple compounding mechanisms working simultaneously on the same asset. Nickerson's title sounds like the kind of sensationalist promise that fills financial bookstore shelves with questionable claims, but his method was almost aggressively unglamorous. He bought distressed properties, he fixed them up himself when he could. He was a careful and patient landlord. He reinvested the income. He held for the long term. Simple, patient, compounding. One final story deserves telling before we fully close this chapter of the night. It is the story of a concept rather than a person. And it is the concept of FU money. The phrase is somewhat inelegant, but the idea behind it is genuinely important. FU money refers to the amount of money that gives you the freedom to say no. Not full financial independence, not the crossover point, not complete freedom from earned income. Simply enough of a financial cushion that you can decline a job offer that treats you badly, leave an employer whose values conflict with yours, or walk away from any situation where the only thing keeping you is financial need. FU money is typically described as 1 to 3 years of living expenses in liquid savings or accessible investments. At that level, you have the freedom to make choices that people without that cushion cannot make. You can negotiate from a position of genuine alternatives rather than desperation. You can take a career risk that might not pay off immediately. You can walk away from toxicity without financial panic. This concept is important because it makes the financial independence journey feel relevant and useful much earlier than the crossover point. Even in the first few years of saving and investing, when the portfolio is small and the crossover point is far away, the accumulation of enough for a solid emergency fund, and then a year of expenses, and then 2 years of expenses produces real and tangible changes in how you experience your economic life. Each step along the spectrum toward financial independence increases your ability to say no to things that are wrong for you, and yes to things that are right. The journey itself is not merely instrumental. It is the gradual construction of genuine agency in your own life. And agency, the ability to choose your circumstances rather than merely endure them, is perhaps the deepest of all financial goods. There is a quiet mathematics to the entire financial independence journey that we have not yet named explicitly, though it has been present in every story and every number throughout this long night. It is the mathematics of optionality. Optionality is a concept from finance and philosophy that refers to the value of having choices. An option is not a commitment. It is the right to make a decision in the future based on information not yet available. And options have value precisely because the future is uncertain, and having the flexibility to respond to it as it unfolds is better than being locked into choices made with incomplete information. Financial independence, understood through the lens of optionality, is the accumulation of financial options. Each $1,000 added to your invested savings is $1,000 of future choice. Each reduction in your required monthly expenses is a reduction in the minimum income needed to sustain your life, which expands the range of choices available to you. Each year you continue building your portfolio, you acquire more options about how to spend your future time. The person with 3 months of expenses saved has some options. They can handle a small emergency without going into debt. They can leave a bad situation with a short buffer. But their options are limited by the size of the buffer. The person with 3 years of expenses saved has more options. They can take significant career risks. They can start a business with genuine runway. They can take time off for education or health or family. Without financial panic, they can negotiate from genuine alternatives. The person who has reached financial independence has the most options. They can choose to work or not, to earn or not, to pursue any project, any contribution, any relationship, any adventure, without the constraint of financial need. This framing of financial independence as the accumulation of optionality is useful because it makes every step of the journey valuable in itself, not just instrumentally valuable in service of a distant destination. Each step adds options. Each option is worth something. The journey is not just preparation for arrival. It is itself an increasing experience of freedom. This is why financial independence, at its best, does not feel like deprivation or sacrifice. It feels like the gradual expansion of a life, like a room that gets larger as you move through it, rather than one that stays the same size no matter how far you walk. The accumulation of options is the accumulation of life. And beginning that accumulation with whatever resources you have available is one of the most genuinely meaningful things a person can do with the finite and irreplaceable hours they have been given. Let us, in these final quiet minutes, acknowledge something about the human beings whose stories we have told tonight. Joe Dominguez, Vicky Robin, Peter Adeney, Robert Clyott, Jacob Lund Fisker, Liz Thames, Justin and Kaisorn McCurry, William Nickerson, John Bogle, Sylvia in Kentucky, the teachers in Portland, the couple in Oregon who quietly crossed their own crossover point in the years after the 2008 crisis. These are not mythological figures. They are not saints or geniuses or people born into exceptional circumstances. They are people who at some point understood something about the relationship between money and time and freedom that most people never fully articulate, even to themselves. And they acted on that understanding consistently and patiently for as long as it took. The understanding they shared was not complicated. It was simply this, that the purpose of money is not to have money. It is to have life, and that structuring your financial choices around the genuine quality of your life, rather than around what the ambient culture suggests your life should look like, produces more freedom, more satisfaction, and more genuine wealth, in the fullest sense of that word, than the alternative. Henry David Thoreau went to Walden Pond for 2 years and 2 months, he wrote, to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and to see if he could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when he came to die, discover that he had not lived. He was not a financial independence thinker in the technical sense. He had no savings rate or 4% rule. But the orientation was the same. The question of how to spend a finite human life in accordance with genuine values rather than inherited assumptions is the same question. Whether you ask it at a pond in Massachusetts in 1845 or at a kitchen table with a spreadsheet in 2024, the question is the same, and the courage required to ask it honestly and to act on the answers is the same courage. You do not have to move to a pond. You do not have to retire at 33 or live in a rural Vermont farmhouse or wear a $12 coat. You simply have to ask the question with enough honesty to hear the answer clearly, and then, slowly and patiently and without expecting perfection, to begin moving in the direction the answer points. The mathematics will do the rest. They always do. Patience, compounding, and a clear sense of what you are building toward are the only ingredients required. Everything else is detail. And the night is patient too. It asks nothing of you except that you rest, and that when morning comes, you carry a little more understanding than you had before. And so we have arrived, through many stories and many numbers and many quiet observations, at the deepest truth that the concept of financial independence offers. Money is a tool, an extraordinary tool, one of the most versatile and powerful that human civilization has created. But a tool, and like all tools, it is in service of something. The question that financial independence poses, insistently and with great patience, is, in service of what? In service of security? Yes. In service of freedom? Yes. In service of choices not available to those without it? Yes. In service of the version of yourself that you most want to be, doing the work you most want to do, in the relationships you most want to inhabit, spending your time on the things that most reflect your genuine values. Yes, to all of that. The path there is not secret or mysterious. It is compound interest applied to the gap between what you earn and what you spend over the longest possible time horizon, guided by a clear understanding of what you are building toward. It is the practice of living deliberately, as Thoreau would have put it, with full awareness of what your choices cost and what they produce. Joe Dominguez walked this path at 31. Sylvia in Kentucky walked it over 32 years without knowing it had a name. Ronald Reed walked it for 60 years in a second-hand coat. Grace Groner walked it through 3 shares of stock and 75 years of patience. The teachers in Portland walked it while thinking they were just being sensible. None of them were exceptional in the ways that culture usually celebrates. They were exceptional in the ways that compound patience and deliberate living produce. In the quietest, most sustainable, most ultimately powerful ways imaginable. And whatever version of this path makes sense for your life, whatever your income and your expenses and your timeline and your values suggest about what financial independence means for you, specifically, the mathematics are on your side. The direction is clear. And the night, as it turns out, is the perfect time to remember it. This has been educational content, not financial advice. Take care of your money, and it will take care of you. Good night.